Good evening, everybody. My name is Andrew Culp, and I am here to invite everybody to our Fall 2020 WHAP speaker series. I am a professor of media theory and history at the California Institute of the Arts, and I want to thank a number of people before we begin. First, I'd like to thank the City of West Hollywood for graciously helping us co-host this event. They've always been a great supporter of the program. I'd also like to thank CalArts, in particular, the School of Critical Studies, or Dean Amanda Beach, as well as the program, our MA in Aesthetics and Politics, which houses this program in which I'm sure many of you tonight have heard of. I'd also like to thank you as the audience for being here tonight, and it's going to be an exciting way to interact with you on these new platforms that are a bit interesting, so hopefully you'll have a little patience for the inevitable little hiccups that are going to be along the way. If you're not familiar, the WHAP program was started in 2011 in collaboration between the City of West Hollywood and the MA Aesthetics and Politics program at CalArts to feature aesthetics, politics, architecture, exciting ideas, new people, and together it's been going since then, and it's been a really exciting series in the past. This semester, we're doing a semester-long series that I'm convening called Blackout, about the surveillance of Blackness. Obviously an urgent topic and one that I've been working on for a few years. I think we have a number of really exciting people coming up, and I hope you can join us for the rest of them. First, I'd like to note our format. Our presenters are going to be in the same order in which they listed on some of our promotional items. We're going to have 2 speakers and then a brief question and answer period. If you'd like to submit questions through the YouTube form, that would be really excellent, from which our presenters will be able to view them as well as interact with you. Note that there is a brief 10-second delay, so there might be a little bit of a hiccup there, but it shouldn't be much. And we also ask you to please be mindful of others in how and what you post in order to create a vibrant sense of collegial dialogue and supportiveness. I may also jump in to do some moderation if necessary. Our first 2 speakers are going to be Michael Gardner and Nicholas Nauman, and our second will be Cory Warren and Jessica Wawra. So with no further ado, let me introduce our first 2 speakers, both by their name, their bio, and then we'll invite them to speak. First will be Michael Gardner. He's going to be speaking on excavating the question, creative curiosity, and critical time. Michael is an artist and a writer. He holds degrees in women's fashion design from the Fashion Institute of Technology, New York, and creative writing from Antioch, Los Angeles. He's a recent CalArts grad. He completed his MA in our program, and he has additionally shown paintings in New York, Texas, and LA. He has worked in fashion, both low and high, in wardrobe for Broadway, as well as for film and TV. And he's currently the head of wardrobe for the Amundsen Theater and the Center Theater Group. And Nicholas Nauman is going to be presenting on chef prep, capital, race, and cooking. And Nick is a performer and writer who usually works with music and food. So without any further ado, I invite Michael.
Thank you, Andrew. Kant After Duchamp, a book by historian and philosopher of art Terry Day-Duve, would warp my little brain in ways that prompted me to search out critical theory, specifically in contexts that wrote about art. This book changed forever how I perceived art, my relationship to other artists, my own production of it, and how language must be grappled with in order to have a philosophical comprehension of the new, the other, the ungrasped. And so I came to critical theory much as an artist would in discovering oil paint for painting. In other words, it became a new media for me to work with. Discovering that critical theory was the missing media in the production of my artwork prompted me to pursue my MA at CalArts other than, say, working toward an MFA. Learning that philosophy was enlisted to comprehend post-contemporary, postmodernist art, and the avant-garde, of course, also meant that I or anyone could use philosophy toward art constructs. And so together, these 2 viewpoints became the fulcrum toward my thesis that was initiated with my simple but all-consuming question, what is art? I wanted to understand art and all of its discontents more than anything in the world. And this has led me since my move to New York City in 1988. It also prompted me to investigate other questions I was harboring but had not yet dug into. The continual vulnerable state of the unrepresented artist, working diligently to produce and find a space to share their works, specifically as rendered through the intertwined lives of Paul Thek, Peter Hujar, and David Wojnarowicz. The AIDS crisis, the 1980s, and New York City. Questions contain enormous creative energy, potential, and locating the right one, the let's say bottom line question, can result in important findings offering previously occulted wisdom within its folds. Recognizing I did not know how to write a thesis was the most liberating moment in the beginning stages of this project. I had read many theses or near thesis writings, books, articles, of course, but at this stage I had not done it. And so despite the discussions in class, the many prompts we may have worked through, this simple acceptance became the greatest advocate in my project, freeing me from doubt, perceptions, and beliefs I falsely had acquired about what it meant to write a thesis, and any of the overwhelming feelings I was struggling to keep afloat of. And that being said, I really want to underline that mentors, your readers, your first and second readers, classmates, the librarians, and especially at CalArts, the librarian Marisa, was enormously helpful in navigating the particulars of online library use. They're all there for you, and they're there to help you, and they will. The Desduve book, Kant After Duchamp, was in many ways a gateway drug, leading me to search out other theorists, taking deeper dives into critical theory. Authors such as Rosalind Krauss, Walter Benjamin, Douglas Crimp, Donald Cuspit, Dave Hickey, Giorgio Agamben, and Michel Foucault. As a result, I found I did not want to work from papers or articles that had already comprehensively distilled many disparate authors toward a conclusion. I felt and found focusing on a specific topic through specific authors' books gave me a greater foundation I could handle more assuredly, but I used the many articles I researched for their citation reference and further research help. I recognized through the many WHAP seminars that the speakers I was most motivated by were the ones who seemed to have a deep personal connection to what they were writing and speaking about. Their investment was grounded in a personal philosophy. They had money in the game. And I realized if I was going to give a good solid year plus to this project, I also needed to be personally invested. And so I considered how I could reverse engineer my life to this point. I looked at what concerned me most, what my experiences were, and how I could bring these together. I cared about art and what it meant to be an artist. I was also very critical about art, but had not explicitly exercised new philosophical understandings to interrogate and give voice to my thoughts. In 1988, I was a young gay man coming to terms with his otherness in New York City. It would take 30 years to understand that I had survived the AIDS crisis when many did not. I believed I could continue a conversation with artists long past before their time and illuminate questions I had about art, specifically what we name contemporary art and all of its variables. What was the AIDS crisis? Who was an already vulnerable, resultant of minority status, and who was made vulnerable? In Kant After Duchamp, my big takeaway was his invocation of the infra-thin. That is, the space of potential within an inert object to become something already complete through the potential residing within. His example is the unopened tin tube of paint. He proposes this inert tin tube contains the entire potential for a painting by his example, Seurat, as already complete due to this property of the infra-thin. Of course, this leans into theories of the quantum, originating with Aristotle's conceit that a block of wood already contains the static charge in potential to become the sculpture. Duchamp then figures in between Desduve and Aristotle in his view of the difference between what the artist intends and what the artist accomplishes. Agamben would discuss the action within potential and the choice of inaction also at play as being inhabited within the field of forces. This term field, along with the infra-thin, would become an important fulcrum over which I rested and then weighed varying ideas, theorizing how the potential rests within the field of the quantum where everything is and is not simultaneously, all possibility and impossibility. Schrodinger's cat, if you like. And so the potential for one to be vulnerable and invulnerable always, and how the disenfranchised through governmental lack of inclusions cast this light over some and not the all. As I focused down, I found synchronicity became more and more useful in my research. Things I had once read or fleeting experiences and encounters that were kept in the back of my mind surfaced and then interfaced with new discoveries. New authors and books seemed to pop up unexpectedly that would become valuable resources in my search. One example is the small work, Manet and the Object of Painting, a brief talk Foucault gave on Manet as not an artist with a particular historical body of work, but instead as an event named Manet that begat modernist painting. I then used this as my burden of proof for citing AIDS not as an epidemic that continues to this day, but as an event which inhabits the space of a prior and then an after where everything is changed, and proceeded toward elaborating this following Foucault's example. David Wojnarowicz wrote, "History has been written and preserved by and for a particular class of people. So in my work, I want to rewrite or give new meaning to the histories that exist in textbooks, using present day experience as a departure. For example, in a painting about the American West, I focus on the steam engine, the train that carried white culture through the land inhabited by the Indians. Obviously, judging by the current state of Indian affairs, there was intense exploitation and eradication by white people of anything or anyone that resisted their cultural expansion. I researched how the indigenous sovereign peoples of the Americas were colonized, brutalized, and let by the US government through the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, driving it through their lands like a viral infector, leaving them to try and make a life out of the remains. From here, I pulled way back and saw how all people inhabit a potential of vulnerability always. The synchronicity of finalizing my thesis alongside COVID-19 was all too apparent and underliner for me in this project. I wrote concerning the piers of Manhattan Harbor as they were in the 70s and 80s, and found in them a remains that became colonized with the positive and revolutionary potential as a place of other for artists and gay men. I looked at the crossroads of New York City and how my experience put me into context with a wide range of people, and with them created an insular world that inhabited and supported who I was and wanted to become. I focused on Wojnarowicz and his work for the stabilizing continuum of artists and their historical train, his relationships to and with Paul Thek and Peter Hujar, amongst others, and how sovereignty participates in their physical body as an artist in the long line of artists prior, and the sovereignty of the second body of work they produce left behind after they depart. And I would like to read just briefly from a section of my thesis, The piers, constructed for the docking of shipping containers and cruise ships brought into the ports of Manhattan Harbor, dilapidated into Greek-like ruins, which in turn were approximations of a no man's land. These evolved during the 1970s into totemic sites of paradoxical demonstrations in a haunted and dangerous playground where both those looking to get lost and those looking to find gravitated in parts equally beautiful and foundational and damaging and deadly. Queer identities were explored and found new ground for beingness and acceptance both sexually and artistically. During a time when meeting in hopes of sexual encounters as pedestrian as heterosexual persons could experience openly and safely in bars and dance floors, queer persons had to navigate these desires and needs through places of cover, in darkness, and situated in desolate, dangerous venues. The piers along the Hudson River became a place of arts exploration in numerous media, sex work, nude sunbathing, exhibitionism, and explicit cruising for physical expressions of same-sex desire. It also indoctrinated ways of being as empowered through rites of furtive searching gay men had become accustomed to and moreover excelled in. As their upbringings were both extremely precarious, David Wojnarowicz and Peter Hujar would have been drawn to the piers for many similar and perhaps unconscious psychological reflections due to a world they were already intimate with and drawn out of a search for autonomous freedoms, escaping neglect and repressions. Jonathan Weinberg would write extensively on this subject in his book, Peer Groups, Art and Sex Along the New York Waterfront. Weinberg's exhaustive work examines much and renews artists' works largely unmentioned in more regarded tomes. What I want to distill here is the sense the environment and the nature of the times then as it was constituted what the piers were and offered in a magnified totemic space that was neither land nor water. Artists also found these ruinous structures potentials for explorations of sense and scale no other sites offered. Together, these components craft a perfect proximity of place, as the ruinous piers of the 70s were neither man-made nor of nature, and so embodies an explicit quality of other, allowing for creations in form and situations that are performatively theatrical and congregational. A willingness to release the spirit within so one could participate in something larger and beyond the self that this setting brought together. How were the piers used and perceived at the time? And how should we consider the works and the people, most of whom we know now lost their lives to AIDS? I would like to consider HIV/AIDS anew, not explicitly through medical, statistical, social, or political examinations, but instead as event. An event not of definitions, constructed through specificities such as just named, but as instead an other, an out-of-bounds context, which provides a composure beyond judgment, bodies, or prescribed architectural constructions of beingness. A liminal space, and how to find a sense of what I'm looking for in this way in order to grasp something beyond the depths and incalculable losses of so many so young, so creative and vital. An event composed of multiple facets and evolutions, which when comprehended from an historical distance of progress and generational change, evidences and illuminates an experiential structure as a paradoxical entity, both of singularity and multiplicities. I would like to cite Vito Acconci's performance piece, untitled for Pier 17, 1971, as a possible formulative beginning of the pier's use in the many ways that followed. Acconci invited would-be experiencers to come to Pier 17 at 1 a.m., where they would find him in a designated spot. There, in the dark, he would whisper in each person's ear some historical secret of self-indictment. This, for me, elaborates the viral infection and has a prophetic lend no other work during this time came close to offering, however explicit and creative they may have been. I do not want to concern the peers with evidential proponents toward how promiscuity corrupted the body with a viral killer. I want to see the peers, the artists who were there, as a powerful and brief light, as a necessary forum that artists found and use as an evocative means toward expression. We should see the peers as media number one in all constructs following. I also hope to exhibit this without sentiment and nostalgia, because artists have always found decrepit spaces, inhabited them, and then real estate comes along and takes from them for capitalist means. So let us know and agree together moving forward how the work of the artist continually transforms, even if they are no longer present after. And that concludes my share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really fantastic. Remember, everybody, start thinking about some questions if you want to put them in the chat, but our Q&A period will happen right after our next presenter. So next up is Nicholas Nauman. It's to you, Nick.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me? Can you see me? Yeah. Thank you to Andrew and Steph for putting this on, and to my classmates as well. I'd also like to express my profound disrespect for Zoom and all police technology. So chef prep. When I approached my thesis, I knew I wanted to draw my background as a chef. I used to run a kitchen in a restaurant in New York City, and I've done a lot of private catering and personal chef kind of work. I've also done a lot of meal-based performances and installations in more of an art context. I've tried to do a lot of different things with that over the years, and played with different aspects of meals, screwing around with unusual foods, sounds, payment formats. And suffice it to say, people react strongly when you undermine their expectations around eating. It all made super palpable to me that playing with people's eating practices was a potent way to intervene in the configurations that make up social norms and structures of recognition that yield the self for subjectivity. But I would also often ask, what is the point? How does fooling with food make a difference for a world structured by violent suffering? So for the thesis, I decided to explore questions like, What are the discursive and material specificities by which my knowledge of myself is directed, and how can I name them in the constitution of a lived experience that denatures the world as I have known it, a world in which my subject position is inescapably tied to historical violence? And what does that have to do with cooking? So specifically, and to make a long story short, I tried addressing these and other questions using some of the methodology of Francois Laruelle's non-philosophy and the critical insights of Afro-pessimist theory. I'm not going to describe those discourses per se, but hopefully important elements will come through. And also, I modeled my essay after the structure of popular cookbooks. So I read a lot of those, but I wanted mine to pay more attention to the preparation of the chef rather than any specific meals. Okay, so I want to talk about my definition of what I call the chef's position as having a particularly capacitated relation between discursive forms and material productions in a capitalistic anti-Black world. First, I look at the recipe as a type of limited formalism, drawing on non-philosopher and Laruelle's acolyte Katerina Kolosova's use of Saussure and Marx to suggest the possibility of thought and subjective forms that do not recapitulate the dualistic violences that structure the world. Kolosova says in her book, Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, we understand formalism as a movement of thought following the Saussurean trajectory, from the concrete to the abstract and from the abstract back to the concrete. So a formalist description treats abstract signs as its material. It is a discursive form that has a productive relation with material procedures. It seeks abstractions that are as self-standing as possible to reduce the excess of signification required to make the move from the abstract back to the concrete. So this is what was on my mind as I read what is perhaps the most formalist of popular cookbooks these days, Samin Nosrat's Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Nosrat says that the four categories are the fundamental elements of cooking, and if you master them, you can cook consistently delicious food. Other factors might make for a meal's memorable specificity, but what if what you want is delicious? All you need is salt, acid, fat, and heat. But of course, there's another thing. Again and again, Nosrat emphasizes that in order to make delicious food, the reader must taste what they're cooking frequently throughout the preparation. So this is obvious. Of course, the recipe needs the reader. They have to soak the beans, chop the onion, turn on the stove, whatever it might be. But those material activities are not enough. The recipe also needs the reader chef's decisions on deliciousness and fitness for good eating. That is, the chef ascribes categories of discursive significance to the food they make. So Nosrat's formalization of the chef's discourse is limited by its need for the reader's material body to perform its realization of food, as well as the reader's subjectivity. So though the reader of a cookbook has a material body, it is the abstract dimension of their subjectivity that the recipe affects to actualize the role of the chef and result in real food. The chef's subjectively realized decisions on which matter is good to eat bear on this recipe's formalist trajectory back to the concrete as signification. This is the discursive remainder for which the recipe does not explicitly account, but on which the recipe's grammar relies. It describes the chef's position. Situated at the threshold between the recipe's abstraction and the materiality of cooking food, the chef is a fiction that describes a productive relation with the real. Now, funny enough, while Nosrat calls her work revolutionary, her revolution certainly does not extend beyond the kitchen, but the chef's position that her formalization reveals does resonate with a classic formalism geared toward a decidedly more global revolution, which would be Marx's general formula for capital, MCM, MCM prime. As Marx details, this is a radically reduced statement of the operation in the material world of the abstraction known as capital. To summarize it quickly, M stands for money that turns into the commodity C, which is ultimately absorbed into the production of pure value. In this way, capitalism finally tends toward an ideal movement of M prime, which, as Marx says, is money which is worth more money, value which is greater than itself. So M prime then is a formalized abstraction of a fantasy that disavows its necessary condition of materiality. Capital cannot, in fact, work without the material world as its condition. More than that, capital moves to exhaust that condition of materiality. M prime demonstrates capital's capacity to render the material world toward a fantastical telos of the unimpeded propagation of abstract value. Capital is positioned as a fiction that has a productive relation with the real, which is hardly to say that capital and the chef do the same thing. Rather, the position of each, as revealed by more or less formalist accounts of their operations, enjoys a power to realize material according to their particular abstractions. And while chefs rarely talk in these intellectually deep-fried terms, A few do specify their role in escorting a passage from the concrete to the abstract to the concrete. Bryant Terry, author of Afro-Vegan and other similarly themed cookbooks, considers himself not only a chef, but an activist committed to sustainable food systems and racial justice. He describes his practice this way: start with the visceral, move to the cerebral, and end with the political, and start by making a meal. His verbiage is different from Kolosova's Saussurean refrain, but the compatibility is clear: concrete, abstract, concrete, visceral, cerebral, political. And for the political to work as the return to the concrete, we must acknowledge the productive role of the cerebrating chef. In Terry's case, in Afro-Vegan, this means constructing a chef's discourse made of recipes that are framed by anecdotal paragraphs referring to the food's relation to the historical violence of slavery and colonialism, as well as to Black cultural products like music and literature that elaborate each dish's situation in the world. The chefs his recipes make, then, become explicitly related with the subject positions in the real history that condition the cooking. In this way, Terry works on the signification that defines the recipe's production of the chef's position. And to directly engage the chef's cerebration is to intervene at the precise juncture where the abstract and the concrete do not meet on their own, where capital might otherwise capture the passage and redirect it to its fantastical engorgement. So at this point, I'm going to respond to Bryant Terry's chef's discourse to specify ways in which race involves the chef's position in ways that work homologously and/or in concert with capital. And his particular commitment to veganism is no accident. In the thesis, I draw on concepts like Hortense Spiller's distinction between the white body and Black flesh, and Frank Wilderson's specification of grammars of suffering and structural violence. Sylvia Wynter's work on speciation and the overrepresentation of man is also crucial here. And it wasn't published yet when I wrote the thesis, but Zykeia Iman Jackson's Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World has also been quite instructive as I continue to think through this stuff. So when Kolosova, the non-philosopher, develops her theory of capital's expenditure of all material for the production of value, she's adamant that the category of animality specifies capital's regulation of movements between materiality and abstraction. And she writes, the complete expenditure of all animality as part of the expenditure of all natural and unnatural physical resources is the precondition of capitalism's ideality. That is, the world figured by the human, which is animated by the production of abstract value, and the discourse that maintains the appearance of both the human and value are born from the founding sacrificial gesture of slaughter of the general animal. They are sustained, however, by the general slaughter of real animals. Going further, in the necropolitical anti-Black history that bears our present, we know that some people are handily submitted to the animal category, where their availability for slaughter subtends fleshly death and social death. That is to say, history manifests the white male human at the top of a speciated hierarchy that is always already racialized. The human subject position of whiteness works tirelessly to produce its capacity as arbiter of meaning, for animality, for Blackness, and for all else. As Wilderson makes clear in Marx acknowledging terms, the figure of the enslaved Black person indicates a living commodity essential to the generation of capitalistic value without the wage worker's capacitation as an agential value earner. This puts enslaved persons and their paradigmatic descendants and relatives in a structural position more homologous to a slaughterhouse cow than a slaughterhouse worker. In other words, the fantasy of total expenditure for unlimited value that drives capital-specific abstractions is historically inextricable from animalization, and animalization is inextricable from racialization. White humanness operates via a self-recognizing procedure crucially supplemental to capital's expenditure of materiality. It describes the subjective form of agency required for capitalistic world-making, just as capitalistic world-making's insatiable consumptive engorgement describes the agency of and for exclusion, incorporation, exploitation, and manipulation given to white humanness. Meanwhile, as we know, lots of people like to eat animals, and the forced reproduction and accumulation of cows, pigs, chickens, etc., for the production of value is subtended by the pleasures of human self-recognition that cast these creatures people eat into the category of animality. Now, the popular PETA-style argument for animal rights depends on the same universalist humanism that cannot appear without its dominated other of animality. And a lot of animal rights advocacy's theoretical strands, like Carol Adams' classic Sexual Politics of Meat, make the argument that the categorical distinction of the animal and the common language that renders living animals as food signs, turning cows into beef and pigs into pork, distances people from identifying with fellow suffering beings that populate slaughterhouses. But it goes deeper than that. After all, chicken is called chicken. In her cookbook, Cooking for Artists, Chef Mina Stone writes, "Meat is delicious and nourishing. The smell of a braise, and especially a barbecue, sets off the most primal alarm in the brain that sounds something like this. Good, me want," all caps. But make sure to appreciate your meat and get it from a good and responsible butcher. As my yaya likes to say, eating meat more than once a week is a modern day luxury, end quote. The shroud of signification that gives the name barbecue to what could be called salted shred of pig produced in dim feculent saturations of violence does not simply buffer Stone from an uncomfortable reality she would otherwise choose not to feed into. This signification buttresses the consistency of the discursive reality in which her subjectivity appears. She interprets some faintly sounded criticism of the meat industry only as an invitation to embrace its accelerated production. She enjoys regular flesh consumption in terms that she recognizes in relation to a notion of primal humanness. Stone's comments also get at a really significant aspect of meat's stranglehold on appetites. Meat tastes delicious, or at least people know it to. The most vital move language performs in Body's encounters with animal foods is not necessarily its obfuscation of meat's ethically unjustifiable origins, but is its near instant capture of the eater's sensation. Good, me want. Point out the bloody horrors by which non-human animals are made food all day long, but the pleasures of flesh eating stand between violent animal suffering and words like barbecue or food, with a material constancy unmoved by corrective representations of suffering. Good belongs to signification as much as bad, cruel, disgusting, but the positive assessment of meat's taste finds such deeply entrenched cultural support that it seems truly immediate, natural, and evolutionarily correct. Stone's comments are exemplary. She appeals to biocentric authority that puts the industrialized human at the apex of an imagined progression out of direct affective expression and into the full grammars of the present day. I think this so-called primacy is a bullshit recapitulation of assumptions that adhere to anti-Blackness and its indissociable relation to animality. In the book Afroism, sisters Af and Sil Ko have articulated a praxis of culinary engagement that understands the discursive violence that distinguishes, in the same stroke, Black flesh from a white body and non-human animality from the human. They call their practice simply Black veganism. The Co's insist on the role that conceptual abstractions play in determining the reality of embodiment and all the activities it entails, from cooking and eating to killing and beating. The Co's make clear that eating meat requires not just the essential violence against cows and pigs and chickens, but works according to the discursively produced reality in which animality and Blackness are made to abut and overlap. In Sil's words, racism is simultaneously anti-Black and anti-animal. It is not that any preparation and consumption of meat is necessarily racist in any community in any location around the world, but that the world-making discursive operations that have used race to designate others for consumption, real and symbolic, sanction the contemporary industrial production and consumption of meat. As Afko says, what Black folks are experiencing isn't like non-human animal oppression, it is a part of it. So their Black veganism is not simply a dietary restriction to fold into an animal-friendly lifestyle otherwise installed in the dominant culture's scheme. The term refers more precisely to a radical engagement of the powers of realization given to the chef's position. Black veganism takes seriously the visceral, cerebral, political trajectory that Bryant Terry talks about. It specifies the overdetermining factors of historical reality that stick to formalizations that move along the Saussurean trajectory of concrete, abstract, concrete. The capacity given to the chef, and in my case, the white male chef, a human in the world par excellence, can be an instrument for resignifying material and material practices, producing encounters with matter that do not reinvest in the maintenance of animality for consumption. It is significant that I don't cook meat, because I don't, but the prior significance, the discursive reality that determines my decision to cook vegan, is where my intervention might yield a practice that does not simply submit to the governing operations of race and capital. Veganism is a useful discursive material, as are the discursive materials of non-philosophy, Afro-pessimism, etc. And these materials are useful for the fictionalization of myself, which I know that without and even often with intervention can and will be otherwise determined by racial capital's presiding significations. Cooking links these discursive materials to the physical world through my body and the recognition of myself as chef. In preparing a meal, I first prepare the discursively ordained figure of the chef I embody when I cook. To do so as a project of radical anti-racist praxis, I seek to denature the primary mediations that yield anti-Blackness as a condition of presence. including the mediations that yield animality as a condition of humanness. When I cook vegan, the possibility at play is the dislodging of the perceived immediacy and the biocentric anti-Blackness of good me want from its unquestioned station of authority over subjective desire. That's it.
Thank you so much, Nick. What a wonderful presentation and super insightful. So what we're going to do for the next period is go through a little bit of a Q&A. We have definitely a bit of time set aside for Nick and Michael. Hopefully Michael's had a chance to read through comments a little bit, but if you'd like me to prompt you with some additional questions or to synthesize some of them, I'd be happy to do so. And Nick, you should feel free to see some things from the chat, as well as just engage in a bit of a back and forth too. So why don't I send it back over to you two.
If you would please read some of the comments. I haven't seen them. I've been listening to Nick.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So a couple of the early comments were on the infrathin, and it sounds like it's a concept that really stuck out in your theorization. So maybe you could speak a little bit more on the concept, how you came to it, what it meant for you, how it really helped you draw out some of the themes of your thesis.
Right. Well, the infrathin really caught my attention most significantly in the book by Terry Day-Duve. I have it right here, Kant After Duchamp, with a painting by Andy Warhol on the cover. Because as an artist, I recognize that I have to pull ineffable concepts and without verbal language, put them together in a different form. And I came to always feel that it felt almost magical to me. The more I learned and studied about physics, and the more I read about physics, another book that really was a lot for me, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And this idea that I mentioned briefly of Schrodinger's cat, where the idea is you put a cat in a box. Schrodinger was a physicist, and there's poison in the box, and either the poison will kill the cat because the cat eats the poison, or it won't. And that prior to opening the box, both realities exist. The cat is both alive and dead at the same time. And making artwork frequently feels like that to me. It feels like my job is to go someplace and to draw something out that hasn't been drawn out yet. And so when this idea that the infrathin, that a finished painting was already inherent within an unopened tin tube of oil paint, was both hit all my little targets. It was both magical, it was based on scientific ideas of physics and the quantum, which are always inspiring to me, and recognizing that there's a whole line of artists before me that have each brought something new to the table, so to speak, and it was my job to add something new to that as well. That we are all drawing from this field of the infrathin, where the potential to be or not to be rests in everything. And then I just married that with this idea I have of that we're all potential vulnerables. We've all been made vulnerable by COVID-19. We can all relate to that very easily. But so were minority drug users in the 1980s who did not receive governmental supports or pharmaceutical initiatives under the Ronald Reagan administration and died resultantly of HIV infections. Had an intervention or healthcare as simple as, mask wearing that we're doing now for our own benefit and for the benefit of our neighbors with civic-minded duties at play, perhaps, if the Reagan administration had been more proactive in this, perhaps that vulnerable status of minority peoples would not have been made explicitly vulnerable through HIV. And so I just married those ideas together and used that as a real fulcrum in weighing variables in my thesis.
Excellent. And Nick, I know there have been a few comments about your talk too. One was just about your use of Kolozova. That might be something you'd like to speak to. Or in your writing of the thesis, what role did the fictional chef Nikki play? As well as what's the relationship you see between some of the work you're doing and food insecurity, food deserts, low-income BIPOC communities, some of the social stuff that's really on the ground there. And then one thing for you to think about a bit while Nick talks, Michael, there was a few questions, some of them about just the thesis writing process. So maybe you might be interested in sort of speaking about those details, as well as a question about the overlap between peers as being a no man's land, as well as your reference to Agamben, who talks about an accursed man, or a man who can be sacrificed. So sort of a few things for you to draw on there. Anyway, I'll throw it back to you all.
Yes, I'll go sort of in reverse order. As far as food insecurity and what are called food deserts, but I think food apartheid more aptly describes. I do talk about that a bit in the thesis, particularly when I'm talking about eating meat and acknowledging that access to not just the material of certain kinds of food is severely limited and intentionally or structurally distributed really unjustly, but also even like the desire and the concept of possibility for alternatives to meat aren't available in a lot of places and among different communities. As well as another issue where a lot of people, I'm well aware, identify really positively in non-white identities through food traditions that include meat. And my argument really my argument isn't that anyone should go vegan. And it's not about like going, giving up meat per se. It's about the way that in the way that the meat industry works as a function of capital, and the way that the subject position I find myself in is imbricated in it. And so it's really, not any kind of universalist claim for an eating practice. And then someone asked about Chef Nikki, which I didn't bring up in the talk, but it's true. In my thesis, I, as a way to kind of perform the difference between my embodied self, the authorial I that like narrates the whole thesis, and then like the version of myself that is like occupying the chef's discourse as I describe it, which is a fiction. I like make this character, and it's kind of like a classic metafictional move to personify an aspect of myself in a text in order to push on those irreconcilabilities that inhabit sometimes seemingly unified self. And that actually leads right to my use of Kolosova. I mean, she's one of Laura Wells' primary interpreters, and I have some pun intended beef with some of her positions, but I do think that in two of her books in particular, Cut of the Real and Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, there's both a non-philosophical development of the subject that is I was really playing with, especially in the production of Chef Nikki as a character of myself, as well as her discussion of the relation between capital and animality. She definitely is a lot weaker on race than she should be, but she does draw specifically on Sylvia Wynter a lot in that book as well. But
in terms of the no man's land that the question regarded, I looked at it specifically as a kind of parallel to the Leviathan that George Agamben speaks about. I focused specifically on his work Creation and Anarchy. And so I didn't want to dig and play into the idea of homo sacer, but I wanted to consider how the construct of the Leviathan is recognized as being neither on land nor on water. And in my mind, I played with this idea that this was a place that artists and gay men would go to in a searching of a greater experiential experience of themselves as gay others that were, illegal at the time, and for artists to find a space to make artworks when perhaps gallery walls were not available, or they didn't belong to the blue chip elite status of artists who had galleries already. They would go there and they'd find a space to work. And so I looked at this idea that the art and the bodies that were constructed there were in some ways not unlike in the Leviathan. We see how the plague doctors are keeping out those who pose any kind of threat to the embodiment of the entire populace, of which the statehood that the Leviathan has been designed to express. And I considered how any other during the time of the 70s would go to the pier and use that space as a multiple embodiment of bringing themselves together, in a sense as one, where artists would learn from each other, where gay men could meet each other, where they had a place to be. And that was more prominent in my mind. And of course, in Creation and Anarchy, Agamben speaks more on the idea of the infra-thin. And so I considered it a liminal space that helped serve where my drive toward making a push to this idea that each artist adds to the body of artwork of all the artists who came before them, and for one and brief shining moment shares something that they've drawn from the field of their own specificity, their own making, that in that moment and forever after is a moment of sovereignty, and that the body, the second body of work that they leave behind, is within itself a component of this idea of sovereignty that connects to the idea more of the sovereignty of God, the idea of creation, that something original has been created. And that's where I was really prompted in my thesis for that. And then in terms of the idea of just composing your thesis, you know, I would underline that reminding yourself that you don't know how to do it will really, as paradoxically as that sounds, that can really liberate you and will give you freedom to compose your thesis in ways that help you to find the questions you're looking for, as opposed to repeating others' questions that are brought to the table, and really adding something personal to the mix. As an example, you know, it's very refreshing to hear what Nick shares, knowing in the process that he was a chef in New York City, and you know, a chef of note, and interested in veganism, and how he brought something personal to his work and then could really have a place of personal wisdom to share from. I think that, you know, that's a very high recommendation to use in your working on your thesis.
Thank you so much, both Nicholas and Michael. Really great presentations, really engaging engagement with the audience and otherwise sort of strange circumstances. So give yourselves a pat on the back, and I'm sure that both of you would be welcoming more engagement, comments, conversations, questions about how to write the thesis, all of that going forward. So it is, oh, and please, as an audience, please thank both of them for presenting. So it is my pleasure to invite our final two speakers for this evening, both Cory Warren and Jessica Wawra. Cory is an MA graduate of the Aesthetics and Politics program, and he's from Massachusetts. He's also a CalArts Critical Studies teaching fellow this year, teaching classes on haunted objects, Clarice Lispector's fiction, and domestic literature and film. And Cory will be presenting on Lateral Radicals, Passionate Thought, and Boym, Lispector, and Lemebel. And second will be going Jessica Wawra. Throughout her academic career, Jessica Wawra Kesselring has drawn to the intersection of art and social justice. Her writing and research seeks the challenge of social inequities and oppressive power structures, and she investigates human interactions in the public sphere. Wawra Kesselring began her undergraduate studies at Glendale Community College, where she was a music major and studied classical voice. She then transferred to San Jose State, where she shifted her focus to interdisciplinary humanities and a degree in creative arts. She then graduated from our program and continues to work on her project, which is related to post-millennial phantasmagoric horror. Outside her scholarly endeavors, Jessica and her husband enjoy watching sci-fi horror fantasy shows and taking their dog Selkie on walks in the Verdugo Mountains. And Jessica will be talking about Phantasmagoria Nova, metafriction in and of post-millennial horror cinema. So thank you so much, and handing it over to you all.
Hey, thank you, Andrew. Can you all hear me, see me? Okay. So yeah, I want to thank Andrew and Steph for organizing this, and I love to hear Michael and Nick. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Jess, strange circumstances finishing the program, so we didn't all get to connect a ton about finishing our projects, but this is really great to hear. I'll just introduce myself. Educationally, my background is in English, and I branched into comparative lit in the MA program. So I took some courses in creative writing and, did some work on aesthetics too. When I was at CalArts, I had 3 projects going. One was a feminist materialist theory memoir about haunted domestic objects, which I'm continuing in part through my teaching at the school next semester. I was working on a novel manuscript, and I was working on this thesis, which is about reading methodologies that are characterized by what Derrida called structural free play. And I'll just say up front what I mean by that, because I might use that phrase a lot. By free play, I mean the realm of the possible that's foreclosed by a structure's center. That sounds kind of dense, but hopefully I'll clarify some of that going forward. So I say all this to kind of frame my interest in the main thinker I wrote about, Svetlana Boym. Boym has become my academic hero in many ways. She was able to bring together many disparate interests, ranging from inquiries about Soviet exile and nostalgia to freedom, and always integrating her photography and collage art practices, and sort of integrating that all under one conceptual umbrella. Boym really models that kind of impassioned multiplicity in her writing and her thinking. So more than just being fascinated by the theoretical work she did, I really recognize in Boym a way of thinking and being that I want to emulate in my life. She really embraced the flux and the multifariousness of her curiosities. Also, before I talk about my thesis, I'm not sure if this is in the chat, but hopefully there is a PDF document with a few quotes in it, so you can read along if you'd like to, but I'm only going to be reading a few quotes, so if it's not there, I'll go a little bit slower. So I arrived at my thesis through previous research I'd done on Boym when I was studying English in undergrad. I worked with her book, The Future of Nostalgia, which provided a framework to me for reading cultural memory in Kieslowski's film Blue. And I was really interested in that project and the meeting of cinematic structure and politics. After Boym's death, I learned about her major analytical project that she was developing, which is called the Off-Modern. And in that text, she developed a framework for examining erratic, errant, and eccentric cultural objects. Primarily architecture was what she was interested in, but she also references literary texts and visual art. I wanted to experiment with applying her method for reading off-modern architecture to literature. And I'll describe what the off-modern means. But since there are a lot of current students streaming right now, I'll just mention that my next step was making a list of books that I wanted to work with. And I had 2 criteria for this. One was that I thought the text would suit the off-modern, that it would fit into Boym's framework. But second, and this is really crucial, and I think this gets downplayed a lot, I picked books that I wanted to write about and that I thought I could remain passionate about textually, structurally, politically, aesthetically, every which way. I didn't want to, just as a quality of life thing, spend a year and a half focusing on, critiquing a text that I hate. I just think practically it's, it's worthwhile to pick texts you don't mind rereading over and over and over again, like 6 times in a year. And also I strategically picked short texts, which again, these are, these don't sound like super academic concerns, but they definitely had a big impact on the text that I picked. I just thought I want to be able to reread these texts pretty swiftly. And, in shorter texts, there's plenty of material to work with. But kudos to you if you want to write about, Milton or Dux Newburyport or a huge tome. In terms of a big picture description of my project, I'm starting from a Derridian notion of centrality. And I'll just read, sorry to belabor you with Derrida and honking outside, but I'll just read this from Structure, Sign, and Play, Derrida's introduction to American academia in the 60s. He writes, The function of the center was not only to orient, balance, and organize structure, but above all, to make sure that the organizing principle of the structure would limit what we might call the free play of the structure. And again, remember, free play means the range of the possible that's foreclosed by structure. The organizing principle of centrality fundamentally limits the free play of the structure. Structures have centers which determine the range of possibilities within the structure. If you think about a house, I mean, I'm not an architect, but I think the architectural cornerstone of a house is its foundation, its beams, its pillars, everything that upholds the house. And those fundamental entities determine what can possibly be added to the construction of the house. They buttress the whole house. So that's the center. And then everything else that you might want to add on is kind of the free play. Boym took this and wanted to consider practices of free play architecturally, and I moved towards literary, that deliberately evade the mandates of structure, authority, convention, and periodization. In Boym terms, these erratic practices as off-modern. The use of the prefix off is interesting. Boym writes, this is very early on as she was developing the off-modern, but she wrote, the adverb off confuses our sense of direction. It makes us explore side shadows and back alleys rather than the straight road of progress. It allows us to take a detour from the deterministic narratives of history. So the off-modern is interested in the eccentric, the erratic, the errant. Her work in the off-modern has been described as a polemic against periodization. So when we think about the aesthetic categories that Western literature attaches to modern texts, modernist, postmodernist, Boym wants to write about everything that slips between. And that was a huge part of Derrida's project, right? It was identifying that the history of Western philosophy is kind of just belabored with the binary structure, and that there's so much that slips between competing binaries. And Boym is specifically interested in architecture that is not straightforward or linear, but that swerves and zigzags. She posits a modernity of what if. What if we oriented our understanding of culture, literature, architecture to objects that are off and that don't fit tidy, authoritative cultural categories or cultural narratives. A really easy way of kind of reifying this, a figure that Boym points to again and again, is the knight on the chessboard. She's interested in the knight's moves that zigzag and swerve laterally around the chessboard. They don't move in a linear, singular direction. And so she was thinking about cultural development in this way, zigzagging and swerving, which would, she argued, provide an alternative potentiality from linear progress. And the structural figure of the off-modern is the edge. So we've heard about the center, and a lot of contemporary discourse is framed around the binary of the center and the margin, or the center and the periphery. Boym theorized the edge as a space of deliberate non-compliance with the mandates of the center, but that still exists within the structure. So this could mean political dissent under authoritarianism, aesthetic experiments against formal conventions, but basically in sum, the erroneous, the eccentric, the erratic, the errant, the unintentional, the unpredictable. The off-modern, in my view, is a fundamentally anti-authoritarian framework. The desire to be off, to evade the insistence on categorization and identification and naming conventions, all that's produced under conditions of authoritarian control. And this tension catalyzes the desire to remain unidentifiable, to evade the logics of optimization and linear upward progress and total management under both political and aesthetic systems. So my development, I wrote about what I termed the lateral radical, which I think of as a literary off-modern figure that's characterized by anti-authoritarian practices of nonlinearity, non-instrumentalization, non-identifiability. Basically, characters and figures within texts that synthetically move across boundaries and practices to materialize dissent against formal and political restraints, both structurally enacted by the author and literally within a text enacted by the characters. So I'll just briefly go into detail about one section. Boym works with a little bit of Hannah Arendt from her last book, The Life of the Mind. Boym writes, in her last book, The Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt proposed a distinction between professional thinking, which focuses on disciplinarity and logical coherence, and passionate thinking, which explores the limits of knowledge and is guided by wonder, not by the need for systematicity and consistency. One practice of off-modern play that I'm interested in is this, idea of passionate thought that Arendt developed, which combats the kinds of compulsory standards of linearity and productivity and discipline within an authoritarian system. And two of the texts that I wrote about handle this very differently. In Lispector's text, The Hour of the Star, she writes about the workplace, among other institutions that the protagonist, Macabea, lives in and lives through. And so I'll read this quote from Lispector. Macabea, the main character, is a typist. So professionally, it's her job to, type out manuscripts that other people write. And this quote from Lispector says, "There were certain words whose meaning escaped Macabea. One such word was ephemeris. For didn't Signor Raimundo, her boss, ask her to copy from his elegant handwriting the word ephemeris or ephemerides? She found the word ephemerides altogether mysterious. When she copied the word out, she paused over each letter. Her workmate Gloria could do shorthand, and not only did she earn more, but she even seemed unperturbed by those difficult words that her boss was fond of using. Meanwhile, Macabea became enamored of the word ephemeris," end quote. And so Macabea is berated for these fleeting interests in some of the words that she's typing. Her job demands that she not pay attention to the actual words that she's writing, but focus on efficiency and perfection. But she becomes enamored of certain words that she encounters. And this, I think, is a really clear illustration of what Boym means by passionate thought. It's not motivated by a kind of professional mandate, but really guided by wonder. So that's one text I worked with. Another, Pedro Lemebel, who is a Chilean dissident drag queen journalist, wrote an incredible text, My Tender Matador, that's actually being adapted into a feature film. And there's a recent documentary about Lemebel. He only has one text translated into English that's available in the US, which is his novel, My Tender Matador. And the main character in that text, named the Queen of the Corner, is an embroiderer who embroiders tablecloths for the wives of Pinochet's junta, of his military henchmen. And so the queen listens to Bolero as she's embroidering and kind of internalizes this hobby, this interest, listening to Bolero, into an excuse to get out of, or to compensate for being late on a delivery of an order. So she's delivering a tablecloth to one of the wives of the junta. And she says to Senora Catita, "But didn't I tell you, didn't I mention to you that I had found them? Can you believe it? An amazing coincidence. You know I don't like to watch television, that I only listen to the radio. Well, one day I turn it on, and one of those programs where people look for each other, I hear my name and I almost died. A family claimed they were looking for me. Just imagine my shock. I cried my eyes out. So many years, so much time without a mother, a father, or a dog to bark for me. And from one day to the next, I've got nieces and nephews, cousins, brothers, aunts and uncles, grandparents, and a whole collection of assorted relatives I just had to meet. That's why I haven't been able to bring you the tablecloth. Just look at what can happen and the miracles the Virgin can bring about." So she deploys the sentimental tropes of Bolero, like long lost relations, spontaneous dramas, immense joys and sorrows, the tragedy of a lost past and the recovery of a found future, alongside the rhetoric of Catholicism and family values, invoking the Virgin Mary, and she quells Senora Catita's rage over the late delivery in this way. So she deploys a practice that's seemingly just guided by passion, that's trivial, that's everyday, that's ordinary, into an excuse to solidify her place on the edge and retain her client, who happens to be a wife of an authoritarian. So I'll wrap up there. I just wanted to kind of reify all the denser things I talked about by giving some some examples from the text. But in sum, my thesis is interested in the non-identifiable, the non-commodifiable, and the non-incentivized modes of play and freedom that no less produce knowledge. It's an inquiry into the relationship between knowledge and freedom, specifically knowledge that's not produced for any tangible, profitable, or material purpose other than pleasure and passion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great job, Cory, and looking forward to getting back to you during the Q&A period. Well, without any further ado, on to Jessica.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Thank you very much to the previous speakers, to Andrew, to CalArts as a whole, and our coordinator staff for making sure this whole thing is working today. So I'm Jessica Wawra Kesselring, and I was 5 years old when the box office horror movie Poltergeist hit theaters. Just a few years prior to that, the Amityville Horror made waves as the legend or curse of the Lutz family came to life on the big screen. Looking back, I certainly cannot think of a time in my life that I wasn't watching horror movies. I was quite the avid horror fan in the 10 and under demographic by the time Freddy Krueger caused a commotion in the slasher horror A Nightmare on Elm Street. Interestingly, although I think I was too young to be cognizant of the full meaning at the time, horror movies have always offered insights into the dynamic of society. According to sociologists Todd Platts and Kibiriti Majuto, horror is the genre that is intentionally designated as an expression meant to scare, disturb, or unsettle us as the audience. Through horror films, we contemplate and process our shared fears and our collective nightmares. One paradox lies, however, in understanding theorist Xavier Aldana Reyes's affectual corporeal mode of horror. Rather than maintaining a strict adherence to a socio-political analysis in which an older horror movie speaks to those prior eras' woes, worries, taboos, nightmares, etc., a corporeal mode of viewership, as he explains, is a phantasmagoria that still readily affects us through ahistorical means, in that there's less reliance upon particular cultural contexts. So as we situate ourselves here in the 21st century, I see something different happening in horror cinema. And I know I'm not alone. Xavier Aldana Reyes calls it a move towards self-awareness or the meta. Artist, writer, and CalArts School of Critical Studies Dean Amanda Beach might refer to it as an explosion or rejection of the genre altogether. Overall, I argue that something has certainly occurred in horror cinema. The promised boundaries or safe space of horror within the confines of the movie theater is diminished. In fact, it seems filmmakers are leaving us with an unresolvable je ne sais quoi to create upheaval. And I argue that this unnameable, uncomfortable jouissance is likely the heartbeat of this broader experiment and exploration I term Phantasmagoria Nova, which literally translates to new phantasmagoria. I decided to pursue the concept of the phantasmagoric after reading philosopher Susan Buck-Morss's essay, Aesthetics and Anesthetics. Phantasmagoria, the mechanism itself, disorients us through overwhelming optical manipulation. What piqued my interest from Buck-Morss's analysis was how ultimately phantasmagoric horror transformed into a public utility. Phantasmagoric magic lantern shows originated in the comfort of domestic spaces, privatized fantasy worlds, if you will, but became entangled in public space. Further, theorist Walter Benjamin's perspective offered insight into this outward public growth. People required overwhelming stimulation as a means to numb themselves to counter the effects of modernity. So while Phantasmagoria did not always take on the task of horrifying a subject, it did take on the task of overwhelming them. The phantasmagoric phenomenon itself transforms and becomes codified within the cultural language, the architecture, cinema, and the everyday. This forward momentum from private to public speaks to what Aldana Reyes calls a, quote, radical or transgressive edge that resonates within the deterritorializing and liberating language of post-structuralism, and with the deconstructive ethos that has permeated critical writing since the turn to Derrida in the humanities. Aldana Reyes defines the core of affect theory here as a bridge and a reconciliation for postmodern, paramodern, metamodern, etc. horror theory that combines and transcends phenomenology and other traditional frameworks. In short, corporeal affect theory offers us the dialogue to address the quirky behaviors and expressions of post-millennial horror cinema. So perhaps on some level, my project Phantasmagoria Nova attempts to reconcile deconstruct 21st century space, one in which we are all public subjects. What then becomes the horrifying, and by what means? So just to step back a bit into the core ideas, through my thesis, I wanted to maintain my focus on the reasons why I came to CalArts in the first place. That is, I hope to engage the critical theory in a way that intersects visual media, and I hope to especially combine this intersection with my interests that look at representation, identity, hegemony, and power dynamics, systems of oppression, and so on. My main focus posited what connection was there between the shock and overwhelming sensory input of Victorian era phantasmagoria, as well as that sense of visual horror in relation to post-millennial horror. Anecdotally, I knew something had changed in horror films, but how to explain it? The starting point was looking at the shift in phantasmagoria, from something that overwhelms us to placate us to a mechanism that overwhelms us to create something within us. And I think of this shift as a movement toward creating political upheaval. And as I've noted within the project, this work is ongoing. And further, I think an important element that has yet to be addressed in this project is this idea of the threshold, a reference to Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, movies too real to be fiction. That might be perhaps why I intend to explore race and ethnicity in the Anthropocene by way of filmmaker Mike Hulboom's Lacan Palestine, or in filmmaker Nigata Jusu's Suicide by Sunlight, which offers a unique take on vampires in the 21st century. So where I sit right now, I see future issues and work that combine the elements of new affect theories, such as Aldana Reyes's, and the exploitation of the cult. I chose to make this overall project a zine project, as it combines the low culture of horror movies with the high culture of critical, aesthetic, and political analysis. Further, zines have always been a mode of subversive communication that often demand action from readers. So I'd like to I know I have a couple minutes left here, so I'd like to share a few pages from my thesis project. So just give me a second here. So this page is from zine issue number 5. So I'm going a little out of order, which is called Apocalypse, Post-Millennial Horror. And this section highlights the privilege of the heteronormative white identity. In this case, I highlight Elon Musk, and showing him as a privileged bourgeois masculinity, if you will. And moving on to another page, page 4. This section of the zine highlights my residency at Hauser and Wirth, Los Angeles in 2019. And so I was able to explore many facets of horror, Phantasmagoria as a whole, and I'm so grateful to have that opportunity at Hauser and Wirth. And on this particular page, I invited filmmaker Britt Banks to screen her horror series titled Ronald and talk about what other theorists, Black theorists were talking about in terms of Black horror versus Blacks in horror. So she really went into a great amount of detail during her discussion at Hauser and Wirth. Moving on to issue 1. This is from issue 1 called Secrets. And this particular page highlights drug use in parallel with the development of Phantasmagoria. So there's a strong correlation between drug addiction that Susan Buck-Morse outlines and how it was a shield for shock. And so you have to read my zine in order to find out more. And issue zine number 2B, which is from the title Unsettling. I didn't have a chance to talk about Dr. Nandita Biswas Malamfi in the initial portion of my talk tonight, but her work is integral to these ideas of disguised warfare in post-millennial horror cinema. And just of note, she did guest lecture last year at the WHAP series. So I was able to talk to her personally and feel a little bit better about where my project was going at that point. And zine 4, the cover is pretty disturbing, I think. The issue is called Edge, Post-Millennial Horror. It just sort of demonstrates this borderline or threshold of reality, manipulation, and codification, if you will. So you're just never really quite sure what you're seeing. And zine issue number 3 is a phantasmagoric periphery. And this issue takes a sidestep from horror to explore commodified identities, in this case, the Playboy bachelor identity, more specifically, and overall gender performance that began to take shape in the mid-20th century. And on the back page of every zine is this overview of all of the issues. So you can see little thumbnails, and I didn't include that at the end of each issue, I have like a crossword or some kind of fun little zine element to re-highlight certain terms that I wanted to make sure people walked away with. So I thank you very much again for your time. And if you would like to see the full project, you can go to jessicadawn.studio, and it is there on my website.
Thank you so much, Jessica. What a great presentation. So maybe we can start with Cory, but then still sort of keep building our question and answer. For Cory, I'm really interested in the use of architecture, because deconstruction as a sort of approach coming in and through Derrida already sort of implies sort of like construction, maybe even space. And I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit more about how you see architecture being used, and if it's being used in a metaphorical sense, or if there's a question of form or concreteness or materials or something else that you think is really important.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And that really is at the heart of Boym's work. She was particularly interested in post-Soviet ruins And the figure of the ruin really fascinated her because it really does thwart any attempt at a kind of authoritative critical assessment. Ruins morph and change shape and change purposes over time. So Boym's first iteration of the book, The Off-Modern, was actually called Architecture of the Off-Modern. And so she was really interested in that figure and how it could stand in for a cultural metaphor for, you know, whatever doesn't really fit an orthodox critical assessment. Certainly a lot of her work, even though she doesn't reference Derrida a lot, I know that she was a big reader of him. My training with Derrida really started with his lectures in Irvine about Paul de Man. And in that lecture, he really clarified what I think became a pretty crucial concept in deconstruction, but it arrived a few decades after he had kind of convened the idea. He wrote in that lecture, I believe it's called, Memoirs for Paul de Man. He wrote about what the cornerstone. So really like the centralizing force of an edifice, of a building, of a structure. And that was always introduced to me as a literary concept, not an architectural concept when I first studied it. So as long as I've been reading Derrida, I've always read the cornerstone and his architectural, metaphors as analogies to literary structure. But really, I think Boym's point is that they can apply to anything. Boym wrote about architecture. She wrote about Nabokov. She wrote about the Rox Media Collective. So, she was writing about all different kinds of media, all different kinds of aesthetic forms. And I think, through her and Derrida, I've really learned that architecture is a pretty fruitful analogy for how anything is structured, how anything is formed.
Excellent. Thanks, Cory. So maybe we can shift to Jess for a moment. There were a lot of comments asking about where are the zines? Tell us more about the zines. How are they organized? How are they put together? So maybe you could just give an overview on what the zine aspect of the project was. And I'll also drop a link to your website in the chat in case people want to take a closer peek at it.
Sure. So Kulov is correct. There are 5 zines, but a couple of peripheral things on top of that. But it is ongoing, so I don't want to just be definitive and say 5. So someone asked about voodoo being covered in the zine. That isn't something I've necessarily addressed. The portion of the zine which would talk about race and ethnicity might go into that, but I have not yet developed those sections in full, so I don't want to speak ahead of time. And I did add a link into the chat to specifically reference the Dr. Robin Means Coleman's horror noir documentary, and also the book, which I believe was where the documentary comes from, and that deals specifically with how black horror, for this idea of like how the subjectivity versus black horror versus blacks in horror. So that's something I'm still kind of wrestling with, how I'd like to address it, because she does such an amazing job. I don't know if I want to take away from that work by oversimplifying it through my lens of the zine. So we'll see on that. In terms of defining post-millennial horror, I didn't even talk about that specifically in this talk tonight, but I see there was a shift somewhere around the end, the turn of the century and turn of the millennium, by looking at Alfredo Jar, an artist who goes into a Swedish town and see they're a big paper industry in Sweden, but they have no cultural center. And this is theorist Chantal Mouffe talks about that in one of her texts. So he goes in and builds this cultural center made out of paper and wood from that city. And then at the end of a couple of weeks, I think, after having seminars there and a lot of cultural activity in that building, he burns the structure to the ground. And it's this sort of phantasmagoria of the space, if you will. And that was right around the end of the millennium. I think it was 96, 98, I'm not really sure. But also the Blair Witch Project came out right around then too. And we hadn't really seen much found footage before that. So there was this shift in perspective, lots of shifting going on in terms of public space and perceiving horror. Like, what is horror? It's sort of changing. So now we're seeing these college students go into the hills on the East Coast somewhere looking for a witch, and then you don't actually see the horrific at the end of the film, but there's something horrible and terrifying about this film, and the cameras have turned, and so I don't think there's like one specific way to define post-millennial horror, but there is a meta element to it. We could look at Cabin in the Woods, where they sort of just blow up all of these tropes. Yeah, I would just say it's like exploiting the tropes might be a good way to look at post-millennial horror as a whole. But not always. I think that was it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. So, Cory, there are a couple questions in the chat, one about Constantine's New Babylon and one about Bartleby. Want to speak to either of those?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think New Babylon is a great connection. I don't think Boym ever wrote about it, but it's certainly, you know, just from looking at it, you can tell it's very off modern. It's impossible to categorize and to place, you know, aesthetically. The architectural figure that Boym was especially interested in that I forgot to mention was Tatlin's Tower, the monument to the Third International, which was never actually physically constructed, but it was conceived as an architectural an architectural attempt to kind of defy linearity. It's constructed entirely of spirals, has a kind of Hegelian look to it. As for the question about Maccabeia, yeah, definitely the link between Maccabeia and Bartleby is worth thinking about. Bartleby, the Scrivener, of course, who says, I would prefer not to. Maccabeia, I think, would, you know, probably prefer not to, but also wouldn't mind. I think that's one of the qualities of her radical, you know, lateralism, is that she just doesn't seem to mind. She has that kind of inner freeness, inner freedom that kind of eludes everyone around her. So, you know, to be implicated in something, no matter what you implicate Maccabeia in, she's going to find a way to derive pleasure and to kind of codify it into an illegible practice that elicits enormous pleasure and jouissance, which I don't know if the same could be said of Bartleby, but yeah, I would be interested in looking at that link more too between them. They're very similar, but also quite different in disposition and outlook.
Well, I think we've had a really amazing night of speakers tonight, all four of them. If you want to, as an audience, help me give an applause to all of them, write it in the chat or send people an email, follow up with them. These are all really amazing, wonderful people. And it was such an amazing evening. Let me say that I appreciate you tuning in. Thank you as an audience for joining us here at WHAP. We have a whole rest of the semester to preview for you. Tune in here again. One way to get to it is tiny.cc/2020 WHAP. It's on all of our promotional images. Our next event will be next month on the 23rd. It will be Nicholas Mirzeff, professor of visual culture at NYU. His talk is going to be called Whiteness, White Seeing White Spaces and Their Fall. It's going to be a really exciting talk, no doubt following up on a lot of the active museum and monument activism he's been doing in the New York and the greater area. And for the rest of the series, we're going to be joined by Calvin Warren, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, geographer Brian Jordan Jefferson. It's going to be so exciting. So thank you so much, everybody. And I really look forward to seeing you later through the rest of the series.